I don't know, just last week, or actually this week, it feels like it was last week, but just on Monday, Judge Amy Coney Barrett was elevated to become Justice Amy Coney Barrett, giving the conservatives a 6-3 majority. Oh, I'm sorry. You've just heard my iPad go off. Giving the conservatives a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, perhaps tipping the balance on an array of issues, including and especially those focused on gender and including gender identity. That's why I am thrilled to be able to unpack what all of this might mean for transgender nonconforming communities tonight with Andy Mara, who is the executive director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Amara. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I love the TLDF background. It's very, that shade of bluish green is very tricky, and you guys have nailed it in your background. So, have to appreciate aesthetic things and at this moment and in our community all the time. So before we actually go into Judge Amy Coney Barrett, and we already have questions from our audience about her and the court, which I think underscores people's concerns. Can you just give us a quick overview of where we are on trans rights in the Supreme Court so that we can, better evaluate what her being on the court means?
That's a great question and a great place to start. So even though time has fused together because of the ongoing pandemic, I want to take listeners and viewers back to June of this year. In June, the Supreme Court delivered a historic and landmark ruling for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people across the country. In a 6-3 opinion, the Supreme Court ruled that trans people and more broadly LGBTQ people were protected under existing federal law in the instance of employment. And what was significant about this ruling was, number one, this was the first time the Supreme Court had ever heard a trans-specific Supreme Court case. It was the first time that a trans person sat in our nation's highest court to represent themselves. And also it was a historic moment for our movement in that that case was led by trans attorneys, including Gabriel Arkels and Chase Strangio, both of whom are at the ACLU. And so to see such a significant win, a win that affirmed that LGBTQ people are protected nationwide from employment discrimination, was huge. I think even more dramatically, even back then, before Amy Coney Barrett had been nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court, it was a 6-3 win. And Trump at that time had already nominated and confirmed 2 Supreme Court justices, and chief among them was Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion. And so what that means for LGBTQ people and trans people in particular is that we were able to deliver a persuasive argument using conservative legal arguments in order to demonstrate to the justices that LGBTQ rights should be protected and are protected under federal law. But I think it's also important to note that the current administration for the past 3.5 years has been incredibly busy with nominating federal judges on the bench. And we've seen a record number of over 200 appointments to appellate and district courts, many of whom come from conservative spaces that have an anti-trans background. A good example of that is Judge Kyle Duncan, who is an appellate judge, and prior to being appointed to the appellate court, Judge Duncan was very much active with opposing HB2 in North Carolina, and also was also opposing as counsel the Gavin Grimm lawsuit that the ACLU brought involving a trans student and being able to access school facilities that affirm their gender. So even though we saw the significant win with Bostock, the fact of the matter is the courts have dramatically shifted to include a number of conservative judges, some of which include judges that have anti-trans records.
Thank you for that overview. I wanted to ask you what is concerning about Justice Amy Coney Barrett's records that makes people concerned about her presence on the court and the way that she can impact these issues?
A great question, and I think this was certainly on the minds of trans people when she was nominated by Trump. And I think what's important to note is her existing record, and public statements that made it really clear that she is an opponent to not just transgender equality, but also LGBTQ equality. In the perspective of TILDEF, it would seem, based off of her record and past statements, that she would not be capable of being able to be an objective justice when interpreting the law with regards to cases that may come before the Supreme Court as they pertain to trans rights. I think another good example is the company that Justice Barrett has kept over the years. She has multiple ties to anti-trans organizations, including membership in the Federalist Society, which is a conservative judicial group. She has participated in speaking engagements with the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank in DC. And she's also delivered paid lectures by the Alliance Defending Freedom, another legal advocacy group that is adamantly opposed to trans rights and has also been designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So if you look at her affiliations alone, it's a strong signal of how she would be applying and interpreting the law as a justice. And I think, more explicitly, if I were to continue to go down the list of receipts.
No, you don't have to go down all the receipts. You don't have to go down all the list because I think, you've made the point of ways in which she's like frightening, unless I shouldn't have said that, but concerning for trans rights. I'm wondering though if there's something in the receipts that you think stands out as like the most giant of the red flags. Clearly there's a long list.
Well, very briefly, in 3 points, she's openly condemned Obergefell, which led to marriage equality across the nation. She has opposed or condemned Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins, which protects or prohibits sex-based stereotyping in employment. And then finally, more specific to the trans community, she, at one of her talks that she delivered with the Alliance Defending Freedom, she consistently misgendered transgender girls and women, and in her remarks, she targeted trans children. And I think everyone would agree that children should not have bullseyes on their backs in any matter. Yeah.
One of our audience members, Dee Barrigo, asks if we should be concerned about the Supreme Court making a legal definition of sex that excludes or discriminates against trans people with her presence on the court. Is that one of the concerns? Is narrowing the definition of sex to exclude us?
I think that's a great question. I would say right now there is decades of case law that have established the category of sex to be inclusive of not only sexual orientation, but gender identity. And even though she was recently confirmed to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court were to hear a case regarding whether or not the category of sex included trans people or not, she and others would be going against decades of case law that has firmly established that the category of sex includes transgender people.
And what before I ask my final question, one other thing did occur to me is, with her being on the court, who does it empower or embolden, and who does it not empower or embolden or undermine when it comes to our rights? I mean, clearly the court is going to tilt rightward, but is there a hard right that we're concerned about her aligning herself with to tilt it even further? Or, do you think that she would be more in the center right mold of Roberts or Gorsuch? Where on this spectrum of people on the right do you think that she would fall with her colleagues on the court?
Well, her case law has been limited. She has, prior to being confirmed to the Supreme Court, she had only been an appellate judge for 2 years. So a rather short period of time before she was formally nominated. But look, what's I think concerning and should be concerning for trans people as well as LGBTQ people more broadly is that we have a couple of Supreme Court cases that are coming up soon. And by soon, I mean as early as November 4th. Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments about whether or not private agencies that receive taxpayer funding, federal taxpayer dollars, to provide government services, specifically, we're talking about foster care providers, food banks, city missions, homeless shelters, about the question of whether or not if these kinds of providers are able to deny services to people who may be trans. And that's a tremendous matter for the Supreme Court to hear and to determine whether or not religious exemptions, how far religious exemptions go. The second case that I would point to is California v. Texas that's coming up on November 10th. And this is a lawsuit that could determine whether the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. And Barrett has been a vocal opponent to the ACA. And if the Supreme Court strikes down the Affordable Care Act, more broadly, that means 22 million people across the country who receive their healthcare coverage through the ACA will be gone. And I think what's telling, especially in the moment that we're in, all trying to, navigate an ongoing pandemic, there are 9 million people across the country who have contracted COVID. 228,000 people have died. And if the ACA were struck down, that means that 9 million people who have contracted COVID have a pre-existing condition that would not be covered because the Affordable Care Act was struck down. Now, more specifically for trans people, and this is really the crux of it, what's great about the ACA is something called Section 1557. And that contains an explicit non-discrimination provision that says LGBTQ people should have access to healthcare coverage, period, full stop. And if the ACA were struck down, that would mean that trans people, LGBTQ people, among a number of groups, would not have access to equal healthcare coverage in this country.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And lastly, what do you recommend to people who are concerned now about the shift on the court with Amy Coney Barrett? What can be done about that? We've gotten a couple of questions from the audience as well. That was also my last question that I'd written. But that, what can people do? And what should people do, if anything? should people get behind certain court reforms, or should they be doing other things? What can people do?
It's a great question. And I think this ties also in with how many of us are thinking about the potential outcomes of the election. And I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One, as a movement, as a community, we need to pass the Equality Act.
That's right.
First, we need to pass the Equality Act. It's a federal bill that's passed the House. We need it to pass the Senate. We need it to be signed into law. Essentially, the Equality Act would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation with regards to employment, housing, public accommodations, education, federal funding, credit, etc. We need a federal law to close the loop on whether or not trans people are protected. So that's number one. And I think, obviously the outcome of the election will determine how we move forward as a movement in advocating for that piece of legislation. The second thing, though, that I think is really important for our movement to remember is that it doesn't stop at the Supreme Court. And I say that because often we do look to Congress, we do look to the White House, we do look to the Supreme Court for answers. But I really do think in the moment that we're in, local and statewide organizing and advocacy are really important. We need to be mobilizing our communities in our backyards. And I think given the deep polarity in our country, and I think a lot of fear mongering that has occurred, especially with regards to trans people and victimizing our lives and our experiences, we need to invest in democracy building work. And I think where we need to start that work is in our towns, in our cities, and in the states that we reside in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, because we know that the Koch brothers and other people have invested in thousands of judicial races across the country to get the type of judges that they want, where a lot of these particular cases and rulings, especially in a lot of the state laws that are anti-trans and pending, would be really important. And so, as you say, we're focused on the federal and we're focused on what's happening in Washington, but we also need to pay just as much attention and be involved in these local races, because that's where so many of us live in places that may or may not be friendly towards us, and who the judges that would be ruling on our cases are really, really essential. So, well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for the work also of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. We really appreciate your work and your leadership and the time that you took in an incredibly excruciating time of the year to come and talk about these issues. Really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mara. And the last thing I'd like to say is make sure to vote. And if you need resources on your legal rights about voting, visit tldef.org/vote.
And if you need legal resources about a great many things, go to the TLDF website. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
You too, Mara. Take care.
Cheers. That was Amy Mara, who is the Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund based here in New York City.